Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today is March 9th, 2021. I'm Steve Shields, President of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and council, I welcome you to our lecture. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally chartered in London in 1824 by King George IV. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, the fourth year of the reign of the Gwangmu Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their third year of support. We also thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea. Without your membership, we would not be able to host this lecture series. If you are not yet a member, we request a one-time admission fee. I'll show a donation page on the screen with PayPal and bank information, and also I will post that in the chat box. Having said that, we would rather you join us as a member. It only takes a few minutes to sign up. Membership gives you the opportunity to support an organization whose main purpose for over 120 years has been to explore and promote all facets of Korea's rich heritage. You also have the opportunity to meet leading scholars and other interesting people in the field of Korean studies. We are delighted to have with us today Martin Limon, a native of Southern California. Martin spent 20 years in the U.S. Army, 10 of them stationed in South Korea. While still on active duty, he began writing on a Smith Corona portable typewriter, and after 4 years of trying, he published the first of what has now become over 50 short stories. His debut novel, Jade Lady Burning, featured 8th Army criminal investigation agents George Sueño and Ernie Bascom. It was published in 1992 and was selected as a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Since then, George and Ernie have appeared in 14 novels, in addition to Nightmare Range, a short story collection. The next novel in the series, titled War Women, is scheduled for publication this summer. After the lecture, as always, there will be time for questions. Now we will hear from Martin.
Yes, I'm here. This is a real honor to be here today, speaking to the Royal Asiatic Society. You'll probably find out pretty quick is once I get started talking, it's the only problem is trying to get me to shut up. So when I hit the time, just throw something at me or whatever.
We will.
Okay, good. Yeah. I'll just start in 1968, June of 1968. I was 19 years old. I'd been in the Army 2 years, and I was on a plane that we landed at Kimpo Airfield. Well over 100 G.I.s on the plane. And on the left were the fighter planes and revetments and sandbags. And at the end of the runway was probably many of you remember the 2-story cement block building that was the international airport at that time, Kimpo International. But to the right of the airfield was a bunch of buildings, Quonset huts, wooden buildings, all of them painted the Army's favorite color, which of course is olive drab. And we were ushered into one of the larger buildings and run through like mice through a maze of, I think they probably gave us a shot, and they made us change money, whatever greenbacks, U.S. dollars we had. We were, actually under military orders to turn it all in, and they gave us MPC, military payment certificates. The idea being that they didn't want U.S. dollars to be taken by the communist powers, the Chinese or the North Koreans or the Russians, Soviet Union, to use as foreign exchange. They discontinued MPC in 1973. But at that time, now the largest bill was $20, but $20 was fine because that was you only paid you were like $130, $40 a month, so $20 bill was plenty. And we got on a bus, Army bus, go out the gate of the airfield, and pass a machine gun emplacement. The Rock Army was responsible, I guess, for protection, and go down a 2-lane highway. In those days, Kimpo was, you get immediately out into the rural area, and green rice paddies, as all of you know, and beautiful blue sky. This is June. This is my first time overseas. I'd always wanted to go to foreign countries and exotic places ever since I can remember. And finally there I was, white cranes in the field, people working in the fields, a little boy riding on the back of an ox. And then the farmhouse the roof was straw thatch. And I thought I was back in the Middle Ages with the Brothers Grimm or something. And I'll read a brief thing here out of a book, My Korea 40 Years Without a Horsehair Hat by Kevin O'Rourke, who was a Catholic priest. And he says, despite great change, this is just one paragraph, so despite great changes in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, Ireland was still a backwater when I left in 1964. I did not realize this for a long time because 1960s Ireland was a paradise compared to 1960s Korea. In the intervening 50 years, Korea has moved from being a medieval land of total insignificance in world terms to being a highly developed modern country and a major player in world economics. The reason I quote that is because, of course, I read it many, many years later after 1968, but when I went to Korea, I not only felt that I was in a completely different place, completely different culture, but I also felt almost as if I'd gone back in time. We were processed through ASCOM, Army Support Command, which later became Camp Market. It was right near Bupyeong, but I didn't know that at the time. These are things I found out later. And the next morning they put us on a van and took us into, those of us assigned in Seoul, took us into Seoul, where the evening before, those assigned to the divisions, the infantry divisions, were big buses full of a bunch of guys, and they shipped them out right away. Because at the time you had the 2nd Division in the Western Quarter and the 7th Division in the Eastern Quarter, headquarters up in Tongduchan. And so we go to Seoul, and I had been fascinated by the countryside. We cross the Han River Bridge. We go to Yongdongpo, and of course I didn't know all these names at that time, but I found them out later. We crossed the Han River Bridge and entered Seoul, and I was just completely fascinated by the women carrying bundles atop their head and pedestrian overpasses, which I never saw growing up in Los Angeles. Or they might have had a few, but bicycle loads, loaded, unbelievable loads. And they took us turned right at Songhachi Circle and took us to the Yongsan Compound. I think we always call it Yongsan. And they took us there to 8th Army, and I was lucky enough to get assigned to the 8th Army Headquarters Company, and then to the Public Affairs Office, 8th Army PAO. And the job they gave me was to do what was they called the Korean News Roundup. This was an internal publication put out every day, and what it was a compilation from the two Korean news outlets, Hapdong and Donghua. It was English translations that would come across those real old-fashioned teletype machines. They were big machines, and we had one for the Associated Press, and one for the United Press International, and one for Reuters, and a couple others I don't remember. But the Hapdong and Donghua would come across an English translation, and it was my job to monitor it, and any story that had anything to do with the United States or U.S. Forces Korea, I was supposed to pull it off, put it together, and then every day I'd publish the synopsis of that. Usually it'd be 3 or 4 pages, and the translations were a little rough, so I just straightened them out a little bit. And then we'd go print it. This is before everybody had a Xerox machine. I'd take it to the 8th Army printer office and send it out into the internal distribution every day. And I used to get a lot of feedback on it because everybody read the darn thing. And because I always wanted to know what the Koreans were saying about us. Little did I know that was really the beginning of my decades of research that led to these books, because in addition to the big stories, big ticket items like, negotiations on military assistance between the Korean government and U.S. government, or meetings at the United Nations or up at the Military Armistice Commission, you had the crime stories. A taxi driver robbed and beat up in one of the villages outside a U.S. base. A woman raped or beat up, fights, injuries. And the Korean news people would write about those stories, and I would compile them towards the end of the stories, put the big stories first. And then I would also call the MPs and say, do you have this one? It would happen, say, down outside of Osan Air Force Base, and, supposedly some Kage, little store, Korean store, got robbed by G.I.s, and do you have anything on that? And he'd look it up for me, and he'd tell me whether or not they had an MP report on it, or in that case, SP, and whether or not it was assigned an SIR number, which means Serious Incident Report. And if it did, I'd put the Serious Incident Report number. Anyway, so for, weeks and days and weeks and months, I'm compiling all these stories about GI crime, and sometimes it's GI on GI. You had, I knew a guy who was very sort of small. He goes out to Itaewon on payday and got beat up pretty badly, and they took his money. It was GIs who did it, And so here I am monitoring these crime stories in Korea, little knowing that I'd be writing about them decades later. I really had no idea. And so I would say I got lucky with that. And one of the things I've found out gradually was how secretive the U.S. military is about crime. And that's true to this day. You will not hear about these bases are huge, like Fort Hood or Fort Bragg. Tens of thousands of people, civilian employees, soldiers, dependents, and 8th Army at the time had over 50,000 scattered around over 50 bases in Korea. And to give you some example about how everything is, for official use only, the military just is reflexively secretive. And to give you some idea, for example, recently in the news you might have heard about at Fort Hood, there was a young woman in the Army, Vanessa Guillen, and she just went missing, so the Army put her down as AWOL, absent without leave. And her parents kept contacting and said, well, she's gone. We don't know where she went. She left her keys in her wallet at her workplace, and her car's in the parking lot, and we just haven't seen her. We put her as AWOL. So they got upset, and they started making a lot of publicity to the point where even the famous movie star Salma Hayek got involved, got her publicity, and the police in the local town got involved, the Texas Rangers got involved, and sure as heck, the civilian police find her body. And that immediately led them to the culprit, who was another soldier. And before they could arrest him, he killed himself. But it was in the news of maybe a year ago, if that, 6 months ago. But it's a perfect example about how they'll just count her as AWOL. After 30 days hits, it switches to not AWOL, but desertion. And while they were looking for her, they discovered another body. And it turned out to be the body of a guy who was being carried as a deserter. It was a completely unrelated murder, but he'd been carried as a deserter, and his family was just told, well, he disappeared, he's a deserter. And, of course, that meant that his wife didn't get veterans benefits or anything. And it turned out his body had been there right outside the base all along. So I started to learn these things, and this looking the other way when it comes to crime in the military, because it's embarrassing to the commanders. And so if those of you who've read my work, you probably see that sort of chip on my shoulder about those things. And my two investigators, of course, they don't buy that. They don't put up with that. And it gets them in a lot of trouble. So getting back to crime in Korea, the Park Chung-hee government at the time, they certainly didn't want to publicize any GI crime out in the village. They were getting millions of dollars in aid, military and economic aid from the United States, and they would just as soon keep that crime rate quiet, let it handled on the base. I personally knew a guy who was a terrible driver. I mean, I rode in a Jeep with him once, and I wouldn't, and that was his job. He was a driver, and he would speed through the little, you fellows all know how narrow those pedestrian passageways are in Seoul. And he'd speed, 40, 50, as much speed as he could get up down those roads. Anyway, so I saw him one day, didn't like him. And I saw him in the middle of the workday, and he's got civilian clothes on and this and that, and I asked him, "What's up with you?" And he's packing to leave. He's got his duffel bag and everything. He says, "They're sending me back to the States." And I said, "Why?" He says, "Well, I ran over a girl, middle school girl, and killed her," which didn't surprise me much. And the military was just sending him back to the States. They just called it an accident. But, this guy was, as far as I'm concerned, it was manslaughter. But you got to, from the 8th Army Command point of view, if they start, there's so many accidents. The road conditions, especially back in those days, were so bad on the roads. and you know, the bad weather and everything, and we're asking you to be out in these very rural areas where there's no pavement, there's no lighting. And so if they start court-martialing guys for these types of accidents, it can come back. They don't want to be too hard on them. And so this guy, he was just transferred back to the States. I actually turned that into a short story, believe it or not. So Army was always giving me all kinds of material. I've got so much more to say here, and I don't want to bore you guys too much, and gals. So does anybody have any questions of me or something? If you feel like you want to make a comment or interrupt or anything, feel free. If you have anything you want to interject here.
Martin, thanks for that.
If not,
folks, we'll just let you take that as an invitation. And rather than holding questions all the way to the end, just go ahead and unmute and say, excuse me or whatever, and talk away. Thanks, Martin. Appreciate that invitation.
Okay, good. The reason I'm doing it is because I'm used to speaking in front of groups of people, face to face.
Right. This is a little odd.
Yeah, it's a little hard for, because I don't see anybody.
Yeah.
And I want to, I can hear some of the people snoring.
Oh, dear.
But, nodding off. But anyway, if I get too boring, just interrupt me.
Hey, Fred, did you want to ask something?
I have a question.
Okay.
This is Ken in Texas.
Oh, Ken. Okay.
Martin, did you have Korean language training as the hero in your book does? He's fluent, almost fluent.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for asking that. My first year, and that's why I say I can talk forever. I haven't even got past my first month yet. But my first year in Korea, 68 through 69, I didn't study the language at all, other than I picked up the G.I.s slang that so many of us pick up. But I came back in 73, and then I really had a real desire to study the language, which I did. They had on base Yongsan Compound, they had the University of Maryland Far East Division, and I took the courses that they had, total of 18 units, and I just really loved it. And after that was over, I had heard of Yonsei University's language program, but I wasn't really allowed to go to it. Although maybe I should have tried harder. But to recap too about 1968. So to answer your questions, the first year I didn't study the language. No. 1968 is some of the Blue House raid, believe it or not, was in January 68, where the North Korean 31 commandos tried to kill Park Chung-hee. And the Pueblo was taken in January, later in January. They took the Pueblo with 83 people, one killed, 82 in captivity. This is 1968, what a year. And the Tet Offensive in Vietnam started on January 31st, 68. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April 4th, 68. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, 68. Matter of fact, I was on leave at my mother's house when he was assassinated before I went to Korea. In October of 68, they sent 124 North Korean commandos to the East Coast. If you remember that, they were hoping to start a rebellion of the rural people on the East Coast. And then in December of 68, fascinating story. They released the Pueblo right before Christmas, and I was working at 8th Army PAO at that time. So a lot of things happened, and it was a fascinating year to be there. And that's one of the things that I guess prompted me later to re-enlist and go back.
Martin, if I can just add, my Peace
Sure.
Corps group arrived in Seoul the first week of January '68. So we were there during that attack on the Blue House and during the Pueblo incident. We thought we were going to be sent home immediately the next day. And Seoul was it was totally chaos. There was a midnight curfew at that time, and when all that happened, the curfew was moved to 10 o'clock, and you had to be off the street by 10 o'clock,
Right.
or you could be shot. It was total chaos, but luckily our group got to stay.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yeah, no, I believe it. It's some people have called that era, 66 through the early 70s, the Second Korean War. I mean, it was pretty obvious that the North Koreans were trying to get Lyndon Johnson to attack. It seemed like they wanted to break. They were doing something, and Lyndon Johnson always thought the Tet Offensive and the taking of the Pueblo and the attack on the Blue House were all coordinated between the two communist governments. I don't know if that's true. But yeah, it was an exciting year. And so I was working at PAO. Believe it or not, back in those days, they didn't have satellite TV. So you couldn't see pro football live, and you couldn't see college football live, obviously. And so they had football teams, and I volunteered for the football team, and I ended up, they wouldn't allow those of us in 8th Army headquarters to go, but they had some problems, and they ended up changing their mind, and so they let me go, a few other guys, get on the ASCOM team. Basically, I'd be Seoul and everywhere south. So I played on the football team, and for the second half of the season, they had 4 teams. I Corps at Uijongbu at 7th Division had a team at Camp Casey, and then 2nd Division was in the Western Quarter. They had a team. We were the Army Support Command playing against those infantry units. And some of the players were, like semi-pro or had played in college, big college teams. And we lost every game. But after that triumph, I came back to PAO and continued doing the Korea News Roundup. But then the lead reporter at Pacific Stars and Stripes, he went back to the States because his time was up, and they had a 3-month period there where they didn't have a lead reporter, and I'm not sure how they worked it, but Stars and Stripes always wanted their reporters, the ones with the bylines, to be enlisted men. We had officers at PAO with journalism degrees. I was a high school dropout, by the way. I dropped out when I was 17 and joined the Army. And we had people with journalism degrees, but they don't want the byline to be, Lieutenant so-and-so or Captain so-and-so. They want it to be Spec 5 this or Sergeant this or, Corporal this. And so they sent me over to fill in for that 3 months. And this is, again, just blind luck. I mean, that year, things happened to me. And so I got to travel around the country quite a bit because we had Katusha drivers with Jeep, and so to cover various stories, they'd drive me around. And, they spoke English, but not real well, the Katushas, but we could communicate. And so I had the honor of, believe it or not, and, it's funny because in the military, when you're a junior enlisted man, they they tell you you go on police call in the morning, which means you get in line and you pick up cigarette butts. Or if they tell you to grab a mop and mop the floor, you grab a mop and you mop the floor. Well, they told me to go over Stars and Stripes and fill in for the 2.5, 3 months or whatever. And one of the assignments is they said I was assigned to interview Carl Albert. Any of you remember who he was? This is like a Jeopardy question. He was a Democrat from Oklahoma. That's back when the South had Democrats. And he was the Speaker of the House. Same job that Nancy Pelosi has now. And I got to interview him in a one-on-one interview. Of course, I didn't know what I was doing, but the editor, the civilian editor, helped me make up a few questions. And he was giving a TV interview at AFKN, American Forces Korea Network, the TV station. So my Katusa driver takes me up there, and I watch the interview. Then when he's done, he gets into his limousine with his driver, and he's got a young man in a suit. Of course, he wearing a suit, and who's his aide sitting up front in the passenger seat. And I sit in the back seat with Carl Albert, Speaker of the House of Representatives. And I would start reading these questions. I'm pretty nervous. And his aide would turn around, like look at me like he couldn't believe how stupid my questions were, right? And Carl Albert, I could tell, didn't like that. He was a very gracious man. And he made me feel real good, but I could see he was upset at this guy who was trying to make me feel like an idiot, which wasn't difficult. And so I got an interview with Carl Albert. We drive to the helipad where he was going, and I get out of the car and thanked him, and got a little byline for that. But then I had another honor at that time, and again, this is all just blind luck. They sent me to interview Dr. Frank Schofield. Dr. Schofield was a Canadian veterinarian who had been in Korea prior to Samil, the March 1st movement in 1919, and had participated with the students, and he'd written articles and stuff that had been published internationally that bring some attention to the Samil movement. And eventually the Japanese kicked him out of Korea, but he came back years later in '56, I think it was, and was welcomed back by the Koreans. But the reason I interviewed him is because he was going to be on the stage, 1919, and the 50-year anniversary was in 1969. And I interviewed him. He was in the hospital, but he was sort of a dapper gentleman, and he was wearing a white shirt and a tie and a jacket, sitting in his hospital bed. And I interviewed him. He had a couple of Korean men there, also in suits, who I think were his government, from the government or from the hospital he worked for or whatever. And I interviewed him, and he wouldn't tell me much because he didn't want to talk about himself, which is, a rough interview when the person you're interviewing doesn't want to talk about himself. I think any you journalists out there know that's got to be tough, and I wasn't skilled enough to really bring much out, but he did tell me a little bit about Korean politics and everything. And anyway, I got an article. These articles I mailed to my mother, who's passed away some years ago. My sister kept them, and now she's given them to me. And I've read them sort of with horror. It's like these are not really great articles. But I got the byline anyway, and I had the honor of meeting Dr. Schofield, who died about a year after that, and he's the first foreigner buried in the Korean National Cemetery. Again, just strictly blind luck. I was living an adventurous life and didn't realize how unusual it was. So
Martin,
after,
pardon me. I just want to remind everybody that you do not have video, so you can't see other people, nor can they see you.
Right.
I've got a hand raised by one of our listeners, and I'd like to call on John Jackson to ask your question, please.
Sure. Good.
John, go ahead, unmute and ask away.
Sorry, I just got a phone call. Okay, I turned it off. I was in Korea in the Peace Corps at the time you were there, and like most Peace Corps volunteers, I would go to Itaewon occasionally, and there were a lot of G.I.s there. And I remember going in a bar one night, and I think at that time I had started to grow a beard. My hair was getting long. And the G.I. came up to me and, wow, I had hair like that back in the States. Can I buy you a beer? So it sort of shocked me. And then I suddenly realized, yeah, these G.I.s are in Korea and I'm in Korea, but they are in a different Korea than I am in a certain way of looking at it. And I just wonder, when you were in Korea, how did the G.I.s think about Peace Corps volunteers when they would run into them? And did they feel any kind of, oh, I wish I was in your shoes? Or I don't know if you were drafted. Some of them were drafted, I suppose, and went to Korea. But I was very happy to be in Korea and not be a G.I. So I'm just curious, how did the G.I.s in Korea feel about Peace Corps, or feel about being there and maybe wishing they were not in the Army in Korea, but being able to travel around freely and experience Korea in a kind of, don't want to say deeper, but very different aspect. Just curious.
Well, yeah, no, that's a good question. I would say a lot of it depended on what years we're talking about.
71,
68, 69.
71.
What year?
71 through 75.
Okay. Yeah, remember the draft had stopped. Nixon stopped the draft in the early 70s. And that made a huge difference because the Army switched over to all volunteer. But at first they were desperate for recruits. So, and this is a fact because years later I was a recruiter, and they did all kinds of waivers for criminals, and they found out they had all kinds of problems because the crime rates went way up in the military, not just in the Army but the other services, until they finally sort of figured out how to do this. But basically, I would say GIs were hardly aware of the Peace Corps. And most GIs, now you're talking 50 compounds, possibly the ones who were stationed in Seoul were a little more cosmopolitan. But when you look at those little compounds all throughout the 2nd Division, 7th Division, even down south, the support units at Uijongbu and Osan Air Force Base and other Kunsan Air Force Base and down in Camp Humphreys and Daegu. Most GIs didn't travel that much, or they had their job, they stayed on compound, they'd go out to the bars at night, and they didn't venture much farther than that. I think in my stories, I sort of mentioned that. They were and when they saw a stranger, they'd always assume they were CID. They were there to bust them for marijuana or something. They're a very suspicious group. They're very insular. Their unit becomes their little hometown. They don't like strangers. I'm overgeneralizing here, but there's a lot of truth in that. And so I would say in general they had very little awareness of Peace Corps. And for the young troops who were just new, if they're draftees, they're doing 2 years, and all they want to do is finish that up and get the heck out of there, get out of the Army. If they've been around longer and they've reenlisted and everything, they've committed to the military life, and they're going for the 20-year retirement. So no, I never heard of anybody. And also in Seoul, this is later years, not in 68, 69. Things were, it changed tremendously, obviously, because the economy did. But later years in Seoul, in the 70s and into the 80s, you started having a lot of civilians, American civilians in other countries, who were over there teaching English, and they started to fill up. In Itaewon, I'd go into Itaewon, and I wouldn't see that many G.I.s. I'd see mostly, maybe Peace Corps, but also a lot of people who were teaching English. And I got to know a few of them more. But I would say by then I was traveling all over the place. But I spent so many years there, and I was so dedicated to travel and learning the language, and that was unusual. And most of the guys were barely aware that the Peace Corps was there.
I'm glad to hear that. I just remembered, my cousin who was a Mormon. He went on a mission to Argentina, and of course they taught him the Spanish, and he also came to Korea, and enlisted and came to Korea. And I went up to visit him once in Uijongbu, and of course I went on the U.S. base there in Yongsan a number of times, and when I would walk on the base, I felt a little envy. There were bowling alleys and movies and milkshakes and cheeseburgers, and my God, I don't have this down in Gyeongju, but I went to visit him in Uijongbu, and I went there. We shot a game of pool together. I mean, that was cool. And he came down to visit me in Gyeongju. I was living out in a little thatched roof house with some farmers on the banks of the Silk River, and he came down to visit. I think he enjoyed it, but he was a Mormon and he didn't drink. And back then, if you came down to the countryside and you didn't drink, I felt like that he had missed so much of what my experience was like with the locals and drinking makgeolli and all. So I felt a little sorry for him that he had come to Korea and had this experience, but had not had the experience that I had had. So of course,
yeah, I knew guys who wouldn't leave the compound. If nothing, they wouldn't leave the base.
Right.
They were afraid because you go at, not physically afraid so much as they're afraid of getting embarrassed, and they couldn't read the signs, and you didn't have to get very far from the base where nobody spoke English.
Yeah, I think they went out to the village. There was a village, usually around.
That was it. Yeah, and that was almost like the base,
Yeah, right.
once they got used to it. So no, they didn't travel too much. I used to take a lot of pride later years of traveling quite a bit. When I really first got a real good chance to travel was the second tour there in the early 70s, and this is really the period when my novels and my short stories are based, because when I came back in 73, Korea had gone from this economic basket case to a country that was clearly on its way. Even the skyline of Seoul, the only two big hotels in Seoul when I was in 68 that I remember was the Bando and the Grand, and they were old hotels. And now suddenly you're seeing, the Hilton and all these other things, the Cosmos and later the Latte, and plus what everybody was talking about when I got back in '73 was the Seoul to Busan highway. So here's a country that's on the move, and I mean really on the move. And that's when I was actually had come back in as an artilleryman, and I should have gone up to the division. By now the 7th Division had left and gone to Vietnam, and then Vietnam closed down, so they went back to the States. But 2nd Division had both the Eastern and Western Quarter. I should have gone up there, but when I was processing in, by then, because I had gotten out on the GI Bill and I'd actually gotten a degree, and so when I got back, they looked at my education. They said, "Do you want to stay here in Seoul?" I said, "Yeah." so they got me a job, and I ended up being at the 1st Signal Brigade headquarters doing the unit newspaper. And the 1st Signal Brigade was spread all up and down the country. They had relay stations. I think they even had one on Jeju Island, but they also had them in Busan and Daegu and Daejeon, other places up to Seoul and then up to the north also. And so I would cover little stories. It wasn't anything earth-shattering, but I would take TDY and I'd go to the 8th Army RTO at Seoul-yok, Seoul Station, Railroad Station, and they'd give me a free ticket based on my TDY. TDY means temporary duty, and I would then jump on the blue line and go down to Daegu or to Busan, and I was just in heaven because, I got to see so much of the countryside on those trains.
Excuse me, I don't want to interrupt you, but Mr. Matson's waving his hand. I think he has a
Yeah,
question.
I want to get Marlon in here. Thanks, John. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, good. Oh, great. Right. I'm Marlon Matson. I'm here in New York City. I was in Korea in 1967 to 68 for 13 months up in the 7th Division in Tongdushan. And I appreciate very much the opportunity to have this meeting and have a chance to hear from you and from others. One of the, I was in the 7th Medical Battalion. We had 4 doctors, a dentist, and a small group of Medical Service Corps officers. But it was a very meaningful experience to me. But one experience that was very important was the Royal Asiatic Society. And I heard about it. I may have heard about it from Ed Wright, who was coordinating the Fulbright program in Korea. But we were only able to go down to Seoul. It was like once a month or once every 2 months. It was a long trip in, even though the distance was short. But I learned about the society and I became a member. And that really changed my life. And it got me involved in all of the different aspects of culture and history in Korea, and made trips with them, went down to Jeju-do, etc. And I was very appreciative. And of course, I've maintained my membership since that time. But I've always been eager to find news about others like myself. And this meeting was one of the first that I've had this opportunity. So I'm really, really appreciative. And I'm glad to hear also about the books that you've written so that I can really start to read what you've communicated. I was certainly there during the Pueblo, and we were on high alert up in the 7th Division. And that was really, an interesting. And when we were out in our Jeep, out in the field, etc., we were very, very careful and so forth. But just a few comments like that. But the most important thing was the critical role of the Royal Asiatic Society Korea branch for someone like myself and getting involved. Thank you.
Yeah, I went to the 7th Division headquarters when it was still the 7th Division of Camp Casey. Just briefly, I don't even remember now why I went up there, I was on duty, and it was a very austere place at the time. I guess Tongducheon is a big city, pretty big city now, modern hotels and stuff.
It's amazing because then Tongducheon was like a small village.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it was actually, tell you the truth, I remember the village as you drive north, the village on the left, Tongducheon, and then the Camp Casey over the right. And the whole scene was sort of depressing. Camp Casey wasn't that much to look at, right?
No.
And Tongducheon was, just like you say, just a shanty town practically.
Yeah. Yeah. And Fort Beaver, I went up there to visit a friend, of course, closer to the DMZ, and they were out in the middle of nowhere because it was all really off. That whole area was off limits. You'd have to go through checkpoints to even go to get from Tongducheon into Seoul. That's why it took some time, etc.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Can I, Marlon? Did you have any other questions you wanted?
No.
Yeah,
That's all I wanted to communicate, and also my
you.
appreciation for being a part of this meeting.
Well, thank
because
you. I'm glad to have you. Yeah.
Because
John, I see you. I've got another question first, Martin. It's in our chat box. I have a question for you. You write so much about vills in your stories, which are sort of invisible in Korean society, and you make them sound rife with prostitution and even marijuana in one of your short stories I've read. What was your impression of them at the time? Were they explicitly intended to shield G.I.s and the Korean public from each other, or for other reasons? Then another question about the book. What do you have to say about that, Martin?
Well, it's funny because I actually prepared something to say about that. When I first went to Itaewon, and this was true of all the villages in those days, because Itaewon was just a village at that time. There were 6 bars in Itaewon. I could probably name them. But the first one was the UN Club. First one is where's you're walking. And next to the bar, they had an official-looking plaque. It was written in English and Korean. And it said something about International Tourism Association or something like that. And it basically was saying that this establishment is for tourists only. Now, as far as I knew back in those days, there weren't any tourists in Korea. But what they meant was a euphemism for G.I.s. And the Koreans weren't allowed in those bars. And to the point, and they enforced it. I mean, I literally saw fist fights. Koreans will argue and push each other around, but they seldom get into fist fights. But I saw that because a couple, 2 or 3 drunken businessmen came in, and the manager of the King Club got up and had a, knockdown, drag-out fight, and then his fellow employees came out and they pushed him out. But that's how serious they were about it. I think they were afraid of losing their license. But the Park Chung-in government could enforce things like that in those days, and I think they wanted to keep us hidden away. And they didn't want the Koreans coming in there, and they didn't want incidents between Koreans and Americans, drunken brawls. And so it was literally illegal to go in there unless you had an ID card. And you had to have a health card if you were an employee. And, they'd check you for tuberculosis and other things. If you were what they used to call a camp follower in the Korean press, the G.I.s would call a business girl, you had to have a health card also, mainly for sexually transmitted diseases, and it'd have to be updated. They could be arrested if they didn't have an updated card, and they would be. The Korean police would, And so, yeah, it was, and I found out years later that they not only used to, when they'd come in for their health checkup, and in certain places, like up near Sonyuri near Munsan, they'd literally be waiting outside the clinic, drive by, and you could see them. They would also give them training classes. And amongst those training classes, I found this out years later, I didn't know at the time, where they'd tell them that their patriotic duty was to, the G.I.s were lonely, they're away from their wives and girlfriends and everything, and so they're actually helping the defense of their country. They'd literally tell them things like that. And I think some of you probably heard about a movement where some of the women were trying to claim compensation because they thought of themselves as being American comfort women. But I was unaware of how organized it was until years later. So yes, they were consciously trying to keep us apart, and I don't blame them.
Martin, in GI Confidential, you touch on how Samgakji was the Itaewon for segregated black soldiers at the time. So can you say anything more about that?
Oh yeah, on base, the enlisted club, you had the officers club on South Post, of course, but that's completely different. That was a different world. But the enlisted club was near Gate 7. Also later they called it the Crossroads Club. And there was another enlisted club over, and I forget the gate number, it might have been 1 or 2, but it was the gate closest to Samgakji. And I'm forgetting the name of the club, but that would be back in the early 70s and the 60s and early 70s. That club would be nothing but black GIs in there. The other club was nothing but white GIs. The one close where the white GIs were was closer to Itaewon. You could leave that club and walk over to Itaewon. Theirs was closer to Samgakji, and they'd walk out
that was the
that
Castle
gate.
Club. Castle Club.
Castle Club. The Castle Club. Thank you. You're right. And they'd walk out the gate, and then there's a bunch of alleys and everything back there where they had some clubs that were basically pretty much the same as the ones in Itaewon, but they were, 99.9% patronized by the African American GIs. It was General Stilwell, and I'm not sure, when he was 8th Army commander, he closed the Castle Club. I forced the black GIs to go over to the Crossroads Club. He wanted to try to integrate. And then in the early 70s, there were some problems that, the black GIs got upset and started going to Itaewon. And there were various tensions and fights, etc.
John Nowell, did you want to jump in here with something, please? Another former PAO guy.
Yeah, Steve, thank you for the invitation. I didn't get in on the beginning, but I have been listening for the past, I think, 20 minutes. And I just wanted to say to Martin, do you remember Billy Fullerton? And
Oh, yes.
his input and coordination of public affairs related stories between Americans and Koreans. I think Billy had a big part to play, especially in informing the SINC at the time through our public affairs officer in 2006. But Billy was there for many, many months. And another person, Martin, you may know, is George D. Kim, who is chief of the community relations activities, but before that was in the G5 civil affairs. And I worked for George Kim, and we coordinated with the commanders of installations throughout Korea. And I would go out on visits to see how the local commander, post commander, was working with the local Korean officials. And we had regulations that provided the manner in which these post-installation commanders would deal with the local officials, because we wanted to enhance a positive relationship between the military, in that local village or town. And I had a lot of opportunity to travel through there. But I go back to Billy Fullerton. How much interface did you have with Billy Fullerton and the Public Information Division of the Public Affairs Office? That's all I'm asking.
Well, no, I remember him very well, but basically I had no interface with him. I was doing the Korean News Roundup, and I had a lieutenant who was in charge of that little office. And I used to see Mr. Fullerton. He was already an old timer in '68. Everybody knew he'd been in Korea a long time. And I didn't really have any. I was too much of a peon. He didn't talk to me much. I don't mean that in a bad way. We just didn't have any reason to interact.
Yeah.
I remember some of the guys in the main department that put out the stories. What do you call it? The public statements from public affairs.
Another name at you, Bill Bonner. Do you remember Bill Bonner?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, see, I was just going to say that. I remember Mr. Bonner very well. I was just going. I used to interact with him a little bit, but not much. But the nicknames the G.I.s had for Bill Fullerton was Bouncing Bill Fullerton and Buffalo Bill Bonner. And I remember Mr. Fullerton, every time when he'd leave the office, at 5 o'clock or whatever it was, he'd say, keep the faith, keep the faith. That was his favorite.
Okay, well, maybe after this session, I'll have a way of getting in touch with you via email if Steve will facilitate that for me, because I'd like to talk to you a little bit more.
Yeah, and of course, I know you were heavily involved with the Yongsan Legacy Project.
Oh, yes. I was dragged into that.
Yeah.
But it's been my pleasure to do what little I did.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Davina Wilkins next, and then Fred Underwood after that.
Hello, my name's Davina. I more had a comment than a question. Ms. Martin, I'm looking forward to reading your books. I saw this talk and I was interested in finding out what it was about. I'm currently living in Korea, working for the Army, and it's interesting to listen to you all's stories. And basically the fact that not a whole lot has, the things have changed, but not a whole lot has. Listening to you talk, the roads are still as narrow and scary driving down. I used to white knuckle it going down those back roads. Now I zip through them like a local. Itaewon is still the hangout for G.I.s in Seoul, though I think you'd be a little heartbroken to see Yongsan right now because it's kind of it's bare bones. Now all of the action is down here where I am at Humphreys, but like you were talking about the bars and the Ville, whether it's here for the Army at Humphreys or Itaewon or over at Osan for the Air Force, the Ville is still kind of the place to go because, of course, a lot of the soldiers don't have cars and things, so it's easy to go out that gate. And so those are just convenient places to be. And last thing I wanted to comment was it's funny that the bars you said that some were just for GIs and some were just for foreigners. A friend of mine was telling me about a place that we used to hang out. He said, no, that's now a Korean bar. So there's still that sort of strange segregation that there are certain bars that are just American and certain bars that are just for locals. And I just wanted to say it's really interesting to listen to, it's been so many years later, but so many things are still the same as when you experience them. So thank you. I'm loving hearing all of y'all's stories.
Yeah, well, good. Thank you for being interested. But, I went back in 2011 to Seoul National University, and I had one day off, and the first thing I did was jump in a cab and go to Itaewon. No, actually, I went to the 8th Army first, and same thing. I went to the old snack bar, And I was very upset to find out that all they had was Taco Bell and Burger King and Pizza Hut. I mean, they used to have, you know, like a steam table and food to order. You know, you could order what you want. One guy used to walk into the 8th Army snack bar and he'd yell out in the middle of the night. Not at night, but, well, at night, but not the middle of the night. And he'd yell out, hamburger milk shaky. And, you know, the cooks would put a hamburger on it for him. But anyway, I was upset about that, you know, the fast food taking the place of an old-fashioned grill. And then I went out to Itaewon, and I couldn't believe it. All these people from the Middle East and Africa and everything were living there, and they had shops. And there was a time when the Koreans, everybody who was in Korea was controlled in the sense that they knew who you were and where you were from. And now I understand they have quite a few undocumented workers and families, which is fine. But there was a time where if you overstayed your visa, they'd come and find you. They'd come on the base with the MPs. I remember a friend of mine was telling me, he said, we were at the Rod and Gun Club. Anybody remember the Rod and Gun Club in Yongsan Compound? And he said, it's in the middle of the day, and they came and get this retired Navy chief. Korean National Police come in with the MPs, you know, because it's on base, and they arrested him and deported him. And they didn't have a problem with immigration because, you know, it was such a controlled society in those days. And when you talk about Korean bars as opposed to GI bars, back in '68, the Koreans were too poor to have a bar. You know, they didn't, if they drank, they'd like be sitting outside at a little table with sharing a bottle of soju. And G.I.s with $130 a month of disposable income, single GI, we were wealthy compared to Koreans. But the only place you could go to see Koreans spending money on a nightlife was downtown Seoul in Myeongdong or Mugyo-dong down there. So, but I hear you. The fundamentals are the same, but a lot of the trappings have changed considerably.
Yep. Fred, go ahead. Jump on in here.
Yeah, and thank you, Martin, for sharing this with us. I had a little different experience being in middle school and high school in those times when you first went to Korea. And I have two memories that I hesitated to bring up, but I thought that I might want to ask how you incorporated this into your stories. I detected as a 13, 14-year-old that many in the leadership of the U.S. Army had great disdain for Korea. And this was evidenced to me in two different ways. One, as a sixth grader, I was in a group of Boy Scouts that the Army organized to go to Chineb for a jamboree, and we had a train car chartered. And I used to ride the trains all the time by myself, and it was hot. And I opened the window, and somebody from the Army came by and said, "You can't open your windows." And I said, "Why can't you open your windows?" And they said, "Because the Koreans will throw stones at you." And I said, "Well, why would the Koreans throw stones at me? I ride the trains all the time with the windows open, and I never get bothered." And it got to me that there was either a great distrust of the general Korean population on the part of the soldiers, or there was still considerable anti-American feeling even as early as the mid-'60s. The second area that I saw that was when I would go to these Boy Scout functions, which were all organized by the Army, even though our Boy Scout troop predated the presence of the U.S. Army in Korea by 50 years. These camps would be run by a colonel, and the colonels would basically try to put the fear of God into all the Boy Scouts that if they ventured outside the camp, that they would be attacked by cruel Koreans. And I'm just wondering how much of that was prevalent in your interactions with maybe not the top levels of leadership in the Army, but the colonels and others that basically ran the day-to-day operations out in the camps?
Well, very much so. And a matter of fact, you know, that it's almost the foundation of my books and my stories. First of all, the attitude of the Korean civilians towards the GIs, it wasn't negative at all. It was extremely positive. When I was there on my first tour, I encountered a middle-aged couple, and they could speak some English, and they thanked me for saving their country from the North Koreans. Now, of course, I wasn't there. I'm just a clerk, you know, and this is 15 years after war. But they bowed to me. The goodwill towards Americans back in the 60s was almost universal. On the other side, one of the things, my two investigators, the main reason they're even investigators is because they're good at going out. They're not afraid to go out into the Korean economy, what they used to call it, you know, out in the Korean, not just the village, but to the wider country, just Seoul and places where they don't even see Americans. And what their main job is to enforce ration control. Ration control, and I've said this in my article in Korea Times, but it also comes across in my books, in my opinion, it had an economic basis because but I actually heard people say, and this one was a dependent wife of a ranking officer. She says, we have to keep the Yobos out of the PX. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't stand to have the Koreans in their PX, in their commissary. They wanted the base to themselves. They wanted these things to themselves. But, of course, the Korean women who were in there buying, mostly women, were bona fide dependents. But they'd find all kinds of ways of making it difficult for them to purchase. And my two characters, their main job is to bust those women to make it difficult for them to black market. And my guy's attitude is, look, all they are is trying to make a little extra money so they can help support their families. And they don't exactly think that they're arresting John Dillinger. But they're constantly hounded because they're using cruelty to keep people out, as we've seen not too in recent years at our southern border here in the United States. So I could go on that subject, but I'm very aware of that, and yet it's funny because the same groups of people who had that attitude would then raise money and buy a new heater or new blankets and everything and take them out to the orphanages and do other good works. So it was always a mixed situation, which is wonderful when you're writing a novel.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody's got two final questions for me.
Okay, let's see. Phil Richardson, go ahead.
Oh, hi. I'm here in England, but in '67, I was a grad student roaming around Korea, and in '68 to '70, served with an Air Force intelligence collections unit on Yeouido. And the summer of '68, got married, and my wife came over because we had an accompanied assignment. So we lived on Yongsan for a year, and then UN Village. Had the privilege of going back to Seoul about 18 months ago and seeing the transformation, which was phenomenal. but I can certainly relate to what you recount about those early years. When my wife went to Seoul in '66, the main square was just dirt. When I got there 6 months later, it was asphalt. And the transformation, of course, picked up after we left. But I really enjoyed working with the Korean Air Force and traveling around the country as a student, and then later during my time in service there. And my wife stayed in Korea during my year in Vietnam in '70 to '71. And so we really love the country and love the Korean people. Found them very enchanting. And yes, we also encountered some of the animosity, some of the feeling of the U.S. being the occupiers as opposed to the saviors, and the resentment of some Koreans against Koreans that were friendly to Americans. I lived with a family in Seoul in '67 for about 2.5, 3 months, and a Korean family, and but then went back to Korea in '68, '69. We lived in compound or a foreigners area. But no, it's wonderful, and I'm glad that the Royal Asiatic Society there in Korea is keeping up their good work. We participated with them when we were there, and even stopped into their offices Christmas time a year and a half ago when we visited Seoul. Thank you very much for the sharing your knowledge and experiences with us this morning.
Phil, thank you for
Well, I love to do it.
Martin, someone's asking, well, they're saying, we didn't get a new book from you last year. Will you release another soon? And if so, what can you tell us about it? You told me that you had one coming out this summer, I believe.
Well, yeah, but geez, I'm blanking out. John over at Korea Times. John.
Yeah. John Dunbar.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was thinking Durham or something, and I knew that wasn't right.
Dunbar.
Okay, and that's only because I'm nervous, but I've been in correspondence with John Dunbar, and he pointed out to me, because I wasn't sure what the pub date is on the next novel.
Okay.
And he pointed out to me that it's November 16th. And I went, well, how did he know that? And I didn't know it. And, leave it up to a reporter, right?
Right.
But on Amazon, they have it as November 16th.
Okay.
That's sometimes subject to change, those dates.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I didn't have one last year because my publisher in New York, Soho Press, got hit real hard with COVID.
Yeah.
It hit New York really like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
Luckily, none of them died, but some of them got very sick.
Yeah. Does anybody here know where we can buy Martin's books in Korea? I get mine. I can only read ebooks. My vision is deteriorated. I can't read regular print, so I get ebooks through Amazon. But I know our librarian, Professor Wells, has picked up some used copies in some of the bookshops around. But does anybody know where those can be purchased in Korea? Is any of the booksellers selling them? I'm not getting lots of people waving their hands at me, so that may be a no. Yeah, it's a challenge to get English language books sometime, and the big bookstores have only a few in some of their sections. Yeah. Okay. Well,
you
don't know.
wanted me to tell you a little bit about the next novel?
Tell us about the new book, please, for just a couple of minutes.
Well, the title is War Women, but when I first came in the Army in the 60s, women weren't integrated into the regular units. It might seem strange, but like, for example, nurses and medical, they were in the medical corps, which was an exception. But everybody else, all other females, were in the Women's Army Corps. And they would even have their own company, their own building, and then they would go out from there every day to various units where they would do various types of work, a lot of it clerical and other things. And that got changed in the early 70s by demand. Some women got fed up with it, and then they got integrated into the regular Army units. They would still be segregated in billeting, which that changed a little bit. They moved them into regular buildings, so you'd have a big barracks, and one wing of it would be for the women and the others. But so this is a time when there was in the early 70s, is when all my books, the George Swenny and Ernie Basco, there was a lot of resistance, even from some of the commanders. They didn't want to have women in their units. And you used to hear a lot of stories that were, I thought, apocryphal. I didn't really believe them. And about, the women up there, they did this and they did that, and they wouldn't do this and they wouldn't do that. And I thought, how do you know that? G.I.s are always gossiping. But it was this general negative attitude. So the War Women, and basically is about a group of women in Korea who get fed up with some mistreatment. About the same time, there's some North Korean commandos on the East Coast, and they take some drastic action. And then George Swenyo and Ernie get involved. And as you might guess, they take the side of the women. So. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
We're looking forward to that read.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Well, folks, listen, it's about that time, and I can't thank Martin enough for joining us at what most of us would feel an ungodly hour. And some of you folks in the U.S. too have gotten up quite early, and I suspect you've got mugs of coffee next to your desks, but we appreciate you being here. We appreciate everyone being here. I have just a few announcements to make. Before I do that, Martin, is there any last word that you want to say before we finish?
Well, just that it's wonderful to talk to a group of people who are as interested in Korea as I am. I don't often get that privilege. When I talk to groups, say at a book signing and everything, I get a few people who've been in Korea, but most of the people don't know much, if anything, about Korea, so I can really buffalo them, and they think I'm a genius. But it's a little harder fooling you guys. But it was still great talking to you, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
It's been a wonderful chat. Thank you. Folks, on Thursday, March 18th, that'd be next week, Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Korean Standard Time, is our monthly literature club meeting. We're reading the book Almond by Sonwon Pyong. You may want to check our Facebook page for a little more information, but I'm also posting the Zoom link in case you are interested. Our next lecture will be in 2 weeks on Tuesday, March 23rd at 7:30 p.m. Korean Standard Time. We'll be doing it by Zoom, and we'll have a lecture from Dr. Soo-jung Lee, who has been on the research staff of the Cultural Heritage Administration of Korea since 2009. She's currently working at the National Palace Museum in Seoul. Dr. Lee has an MA in art history from Dongguk University, which, as many of you may know, is a Buddhist university. And she has a PhD in conservation studies from York University. She'll be discussing how to understand Korean Buddhist art. She says she can help us learn how to read Buddhist art, which is easy peasy lemon squeezy. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again and good night.